definition of insanity is.
I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish. But Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time.
Remember, no Russian.
Nobody puts baby in a corner.
Are you not entertained?
Hello, beautiful people. Today on the Real Awards, we're going to tackle the 2000 Video Game Awards. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, Johnny, there were no Video Game Awards back then. And to that I say, you're right. However, they did still have award shows back then. In fact, at this time, the equivalent to today's VGAs was called the GDC, or Game Developer Conference. This year's GDC was held in San Jose, California, between 9 to 13 March, and winners were of course chosen by game developers around the industry. While this does make sense to a certain extent, it also causes problems when you look at certain awards such as Game of the Year, because game developers are looking through a different lens than those that play the games themselves. And so, for that particular reason, I've decided to restructure the awards into 9 simple categories for now, and pick the nominees and winners myself. This will be very different to my other Real Awards videos, seeing as how I won't be correcting anything so much as just having my own awards show, but I feel like it'll be fun, so let's dive in. Best Video Game Narrative. And the nominees for Best Narrative are Escape from Monkey Island,
Riot. Fire!
Deus Ex,
Heads up, JC.
The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, Vampire: The Masquerade,
For blasphemy, Geralt celebrates the transfiguration of death.
Baldur's Gate 2,
Ah, the child of Baal has awoken. It is time for more experiments.
Final Fantasy 9, Now in today's VGAs, a lot of the quote-unquote smaller awards get breezed by to leave more room for commercials and plugs.
Like no other razor.
Hydrobot, taking it to the next level, that was sick. You think you can go for a few more rounds?
And the bigger, more important awards are talked about in further detail and given more attention. We aren't going to do that, so let's give every category a fair shake. For the award in Video Game Narrative, the winner is Final Fantasy IX by Square Enix. Now, what can be said about Final Fantasy that hasn't already been gushed about in thousands of other videos? Well, not much, but here's my take on it. Final Fantasy as a series has gotten so many people through so many dark places in life, and that's usually because of the grand stories and amazing characters. For me, Final Fantasy IX was the grandest story, with the characters I had a connection with the most. Whether it was Garnet's attempt at discovering who she is as a person, and who she wants to be, or if it was Freya's attempt to find the one she loves the most, no matter what the cost. Or even if it's Steiner's realization that you can't always just believe what you're told. There is a character for just about everyone to love, and the story's stakes feel even more grandiose because you care about what is happening to the characters. Majora's Mask was a very close runner-up, but when looking at the story as a whole, it was clear to me that Final Fantasy IX was the winner. Best Audio Design. The nominees for Best Audio Design are Pokemon Gold and Silver, Hitman, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Diablo 2, Final Fantasy IX. another category that often gets looked over but cannot be understated. Bad audio design is really, really easy to point out. Your ears will scream to your brain, and the distaste for a game will grow. Having good audio design is a pinnacle to making a great game, and while today a whole lot of games have great audio, in the year 2000 it was not as much of a serious thing as today. But one game did stand out past the rest, and so, the winner for Best Audio Design is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. This game blends the sound of board tricks, skating along the asphalt, jumping off ramps, and even landing back down on the ground and grinding so perfectly for the time, and it blends ever so well with that perfect soundtrack in the back. The soundtrack, while not original, added so much to this game, and not having the music drown out the impactful sounds of boarding was so crucial. Every moment and trick, and even something as simple as picking up the letters to spell out skate, are all so satisfying to hear. And while there are not many layers to have to control here, not many other games had crazy audio loops to jump through either. So for me, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 is the clear winner. Best Art Direction. The nominees for Best Art Direction are The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Final Fantasy IX, Diablo 2, Hitman, Paper Mario. The whole reason I even started this series was because of my mass appreciation for almost all forms of modern art. Best art direction means a lot to me, as is almost always why I'm drawn to a game. If I find your game to be stunning, or in an art style outside of the norm that speaks to me, or even simple yet beautiful, I'm hooked from moment one. Gameplay, music, and direction all mean a tremendous amount as well, but as far as getting me to buy a ticket to gain access, the art direction is everything. And so, for this year's winner, for Best Art Direction, is Final Fantasy IX. Another category where my top pick just barely edges out Majora's Mask. But let me explain. Majora's Mask was and still is a beautiful game, with a fantastic art direction. But a whole lot of the models, and even the main town of Clocktown, are kind of lackluster. The enemy design and costume design for some of the characters are done extremely well, but I don't see it throughout the whole game. With that said, in Final Fantasy IX, from the monster design all the way to the costumes, this world feels so fleshed out when playing it. And if you're like me and you get pulled into a world that you're in, this game can really make you feel like this world could be real. Each and every new city, state, or continent you come to feels as though it is lived in. I bought in real quick because of the beauty of the airships, cities, and the absolute wonder of the open world. And characters and bosses are great too. I couldn't even begin to see how I could choose anything else over Final Fantasy IX. Best Game Direction. The nominees for Best Game Direction are The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, Time Splitters, Escape from Monkey Island,
I'll go back. And I'll see if I can scrap.
Perfect Dark, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Final Fantasy IX. The game design, the gameplay loop, the cohesiveness of one person or an entire team's idea being put into the game. Game direction is extremely important. And whether it's one man's vision or an entire development team's Frankenstein's monster, putting it all together and making the game resonate in all aspects of gaming is one of the easiest things to point out when playing a game. The winner for this year's game direction is Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. As much as I have gushed about Final Fantasy IX, and as cohesive and great of a game as it is, Majora's Mask just barely edges it out in this category for a few reasons. The 72-hour time loop was such an ingenious idea in creating stakes and giving the player a sense of urgency. While most game directors would shy away from giving their players a time limit on beating it because they want the players to enjoy their open world or play around with mechanics, this idea works so well in this game. The choice not only solidifies the threat that the player is against, but also forces the player to plan out every action and not lose sight of the end goal. A big problem with games today and the whole open world concept is that the games lose their cohesiveness for some players, because they end up so lost in this world and doing everything but the actual story, that when they come back to the story they lose sight of what it was even about, and they never really feel like they're in a dire need to get anything done. Majora's Mask creators knew the story was the greatest aspect of this game, and therefore they built the game's mechanics around getting the player to enjoy that story and play it through to the end. Best Score and Music. The nominees for Best Score and Music are Pokemon Gold and Silver, Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, Banjo-Tooie, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Paper Mario, Final Fantasy IX, the music of a game is like the whipped cream on top of a perfect hot cocoa. Everything else can be perfect and you'll have a great cup, but if it doesn't have that score that draws you in even more and evokes emotions out of you, then it's just a good cup of cocoa with no whipped cream. Now after that allegory, what I'm really trying to say is that music is that background effect that has such a huge impact on a player's enjoyment and immersion. And for me, it is something that ties a great game into a masterpiece. My pick for this year's Best Score in Music is The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. In Majora's Mask, those first notes invoke a childlike sense of adventure, imagination, and a general desire to explore. But then halfway through the opening, we're greeted with a much darker tone. This soundtrack maintains these themes and more, including some of the most dark in the series' history. The Legend of Zelda series has been a pinnacle when it comes to video game music, and Majora's Mask was one of the best soundtracks put out for these legendary games. A big reason video game music is taken seriously today is in part to this legendary series. Best Action Game. The nominees for Best Action Game are Hitman, Perfect Dark, Deus Ex,
Already discussed the matter with the senator.
Time Splitters, finally a category where neither Majora's Mask nor Final Fantasy IX can take the win. Action games were a lot less of a focus back in the early 2000s, or at least they were taken less seriously. We were still kind of in that platformer phase that the 90s was so well known for, and the action-adventure and RPG games were still huge categories that developers focused on. That's not to say the 2000s didn't have a lot of wonderful action games. Every one of these nominees has its own strengths and weaknesses, and this was easily the closest category as far as top to bottom with how close every game was to taking the number one spot. With that said, the winner for Best Action Game is Deus Ex. Hitman was a close second for anyone who was curious, and while that series definitely became a pillar in action games, and the Deus Ex series definitely ended up becoming more RPG focused later on, Deus Ex was a slightly better game in this year's category. The mechanics and gameplay are so important for an action game, as they normally have a generic story. But Deus Ex was like a Swiss Army knife for action games, coming with an intriguing story about a powerful corporation looking to control the world with a virus, something that seems more and more possible every day. The story was no slouch. The gameplay is also a greatly appreciated piece of this game. With a multitude of ever-growing tools at your disposal, how you take on a mission is completely your choice. And while Hitman had a similar gameplay idea, Deus Ex pulled it off slightly better. Best Action Adventure Game. And the nominees for Best Action Adventure Game are Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, Spider-Man,
Find her. Got no choice.
Banjo-Tooie, Medieval 2, Now this category was almost the opposite in comparison to the last one as far as competition goes. While every game I nominated deserves to be nominated, there was never a question on which game would win this award. The winner is The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Spider-Man was one of the most nostalgic experiences I've had since I started this series, as I played a lot of this as a child. When I would go over to my babysitter's house in Tennessee, her son had all these awesome games, and Spider-Man on the N64. I played this game for so many hours, and while I do adore it, Majora's Mask is just a better game in every way. From the mechanics we talked about earlier, leading to that sense of urgency, to the story being iconic, and the music being that sick whipped cream on top. This game is one of the best of all time, and easily the best action-adventure game of the year 2000. Best Role-Playing Game. And the nominees for Best Role-Playing Game are Paper Mario, Vagrant Story, Pokemon Gold and Silver, Baldur's Gate 2, Final Fantasy IX, Diablo 2. Let me start this off by being extremely transparent. I am a huge Pokemon fanboy. I spent a 2-year span of my life in Japan and went to just about every Pokestop they had, from Odaiba to Osaka. I own so much memorabilia, every game they have, and a shit ton of collectibles. Short of the trading card game, I own almost everything there is to buy when it comes to Pokemon. With that said, I'll go ahead and announce the winner. Final Fantasy IX. So I know that rant I just went on about Pokemon seems kind of pointless when I announce Final Fantasy as my winner, but I think that it gives you more insight into how good of a game Final Fantasy IX actually was. Final Fantasy IX was just too good not to be the best RPG this year. If even I, as a huge Pokemon fan, can notice that Final Fantasy IX was that much better than every other game on this list, then hopefully that proves that I never choose based off bias, and I always pick what I genuinely feel is the best. In fact, even consider Diablo 2 and Paper Mario to be better in this year's awards than Pokemon Gold and Silver. And let it be known, this won't be the last time Pokemon is on my list. Final Fantasy IX is a once-in-a-generation game, and deserves this award hands down. Game of the Year. The nominees for Game of the Year are Diablo 2, The Sims, Paper Mario, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, Final Fantasy IX, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, all the awards prior lead up to this right here. You can win every other award, but this is the one that's coveted the most. With every single game today claiming it was the game of the year at some point, the real game of the year is usually really transparent, or is highly debated between 1 to 3 games. Every nominee had a genuine shot at winning this award, but we all know it was really a battle between two giants that will go down in history as some of the best games ever made, and two of the biggest franchises of all time. Without further ado, the winner for Game of the Year is Final Fantasy IX. The Sims had won Game of the Year at these awards in 2000, and the reason for that is obvious. The Sims was a technical marvel back then, and while it is amazing in its own right, being a technical marvel, in my opinion, does not automatically make you Game of the Year. And of course, I'm looking with the lens of a player, not a developer, so I can understand why it won. But in 100 years, Final Fantasy IX and Majora's Mask will be remembered, replayed, replicated, a whole lot more than Sims, and for good reason. Final Fantasy IX gave me the grandest adventure, the most fun, immersed me harder than any game, had a unified idea, and the music and gameplay loop to back it up, on top of an amazing world, characters I cared about, and a satisfying amount of charm. Final Fantasy IX, you were the Real Game Awards Game of the Year for 2000. Thank you all for watching, and I just wanted to say that I greatly appreciate every single one of you. Even if you stop by for just 1 minute of my videos, it means a lot to me. These award shows just started, and I'm having a lot of fun putting them together, so I hope you're having fun watching. And as always, for any of you nerds out there who want to hear the numbers, let's get to them. For this video, I ended up dedicating 313 hours to playing games, 15 hours of editing, 80 hours of video game music listened to, and 18 games nominated for awards, with 9 eventual awards given out.